Formerly, he was CEO of Clean Caribbean and Americas, and he's a recognized expert on international aspects of coastal preparedness and response, in particular on the science and use of dispersants to combat oil spills. So, please go right ahead. I have your timer right here if you need it.
Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here, especially given some of the great speakers we have. Coast Guard, shout out. My brother's a Coast Guard Master Chief, so he would be happy to know you're here. And I'm going to show a slide shortly with Commandant of the Coast Guard several years ago. Maybe one of you folks will be there in the future, who knows. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the science of dispersants from the perspective of why it was done and used in Deepwater Horizon. So I'll just start off with, in Deepwater Horizon, my organization was flying into Hercules with the ADS-PAC spraying. We did 80 missions. We sprayed about almost 40% of all the dispersants sprayed by air. And we did it at a dispersant to oil ratio, which is not an exact science because you never know the exact thickness of the oil, of 1 to 20, which was, we set and calibrated our equipment at 5 gallons per acre. So this was beginning on like day 3 of the spill. We got a call, we need you, and we went. So how did that happen? The reality was there's quite a bit of dispersant science at that time. We did not say, let's go spray dispersant in the Gulf of Mexico. We were asked to do it by the responsible party who had authority from the U.S. Coast Guard. It was not our decision, it never is. We're the ones who do the job though. So you can see this is the airplane flying along the edge of the oil slick on the 22nd of May in 2010. So in the center there, you can see 4 stars, Admiral Thad Allen. And this is a statement I really think you need to understand dispersants. You need to understand what he said. And what he said is nothing good happens when oil spills. And the reality is we talk about the use of dispersants and other means, very often we're talking as though there's no alternatives. Well, the alternative is you have bad and bad. And so we're trying to figure out what we can do to minimize the damage. So let's keep that in mind as we talk, because it plays very much into matters of net environmental benefit analysis and the trade-offs that are part of that. So you have an oil spill, what are your options? There aren't a lot of them. One is you monitor only and you look at natural degradation, you do some modeling, surveillance, visualization work, and I have been involved in spills in one off of Cuba one time, where that's all we did. We monitored for 5 days and we determined that it was not going to head ashore, and we actually just continued to model, monitor, do overflights, and by 5 days we were done. But most of the time we're going to do something, and so your options are to, first of all, try to do source control. That's the best thing you can do if you can, but you're still going to have some oil to deal with. So we're looking at these options here. We've already talked about mechanical recovery and in situ burning, and if all else fails, you're on the shoreline doing shoreline cleanup. So what's going to determine that? What are the drivers? And it's relatively simple as well. First of all, the health and safety of the community, but also responders. And there are going to be times when, due to concerns about the health and safety of responders, given terrible weather or things like that, we may not be able to do anything for some period of time. We're looking at the feasibility of response. Certainly geography and weather affect that. The types and fates of spilled oil, the resources at risk, very important. And I thank Dr. Overton for opening that issue of the highest priority tend to be coastal marshes and the coastline itself. And that was the case in Deepwater Horizon. Priorities, the stakeholder priorities are important. Resources for response, expectations, very important to talk about net environmental benefit analysis, because this is going to be, given these other factors, what are you going to choose to take care of first? Where are you going to apply your limited resources? And finally, a major thing, and this is very important for offshore situations, is the scale and effectiveness. The scale of the Deepwater Horizon or a subsea blowout is huge. And so you get a situation where you have to have some type of method of response that can match it in scale and also be huge. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. Dr. Overton talked a little bit about the effects of the oil on the marine environment. And I'll just mention that I give this talk in 4-hour seminars, 1-day seminars, 2-day seminars, and we talk about all of these things in great length. 20 minutes, we're going to do a very superficial coverage of it. But I think, when we're looking at what are we doing, we're trying to look at what are the effects of the oil across the board on the environment, and then what are we going to try to do to try to minimize those effects to the environment and the creatures in them. From a matter of scale, you can see this is, I used to show a picture of a very small oil spill, very well contained. Well, that's great. If you have that situation, you don't need to use dispersants. Just put a skimmer in and you're good. But when you're talking about offshore, which is either going to be a major tanker incident, a major pipeline incident, or more likely an upstream incident of some type of blowout or problem, you're going to talk about massive amount of oil and ones that are going to overwhelm you from a scale perspective. You can see the line in there where the arrow is. That is what a boat, a vessel like Frank Paskowitz CGA or MSRC, that's going through the slick. And you can see from a scale perspective, it's really not doing an awful lot. It's better than nothing, but it's not doing an awful lot. Dr. Overton mentioned there are some natural processes that take place. These are 2 samples of South Louisiana crude, one with seawater, and you can see there's some dispersion going on naturally. But the one on the right shows chemically enhanced dispersion, as in the use of dispersants. So a completely different picture. What we're trying to do is enhance the natural process. So one of the things that we're looking at with an oil spill is where is that oil going to go? And generally speaking, oil moves by current and by winds. There's also a tide element of it, but tides move back and forth, back and forth, back and forth every 12 hours. But what brings oil ashore are winds. Currents tend to go alongside a coast, but winds are what's going to bring it ashore, onshore winds. So one of the things we want to do with dispersants, and one of the purposes, is to avoid the encounter with the shoreline, is to take the wind vector out of the equation. If we disperse the oil and put it into the water column, then the wind vector is no longer a player, and it becomes just the current vector and nominal tides. So that's a major way of preventing oil from reaching the shoreline. So what are we doing with dispersant? This is the mechanism. You've got a slick on the surface. There's very, very little parts of that slick, of that oil, that is actually soluble in water. There are a few things that are, but for the most part, it's going to stay coherent and on the surface. It will split up and move in different places, but what we're going to do with an untreated slick is apply dispersant, and if you can see the little dispersant molecules there, there's two ends. There are surfactant, which is basically synonymous with a soap. The surfactant has one end that will attach to the oil, and the other end that attaches to water, and it breaks it up. This is the same thing that happens when you wash dishes. When you take your oils and fats in your sink and apply soap to them, you break it up, and your once clear water becomes cloudy, and it becomes cloudy because it's forming a lot of stabilized droplets, very small stabilized droplets. We call them micelles in chemistry. And ultimately, those stabilized droplets dilute and diffuse into the water column when we use dispersants. So what we're trying to get is that bottom slide. Now, I have to tell you, one of the things I get $1 from every time I hear it is somebody say we're sinking the oil. And we are not sinking the oil. I'll explain a little bit later, and I won't go through too deep, but we're dispersing the oil. We're not sinking it. Matter of fact, those droplets, if all else is even and there's no energy in the system, they will float back to the top. So this is what a Micelle does, and one of the interesting things about a Micelle is it's stabilized. By stabilized, I mean it tends not to adhere and to things like feathers and beaches and docks and other things. And it tends to be relatively stable and doesn't recoalesce itself. So the dispersant mechanism is such as this. The oil gets broken up at the surface, is dispersed in the top part of the water column, various size of droplet sizes. And you can see here, they can be many and varied sizes. This is not actually dispersed oil, but it gives a good view of it. This is just oil that's been shaken up, and you can see that you have different sized droplets. And what we do with dispersants is we increase, every time we take a big droplet and make it into thousands, if not millions of smaller droplets, we increase the surface area by 2-3 quantum levels, so from tens to hundreds to thousands to millions. So now we have more surface for biodegradation, and these are, again, relatively stable and don't re-adhere and stick to each other. So when you have this situation, on the top left, we're applying dispersants. You get some bacterial colonization and then biodegradation over the course of a couple weeks, and ultimately it works its way down through the food chain. So we have not, in reality, taken the oil out of the environment the way you might do if you used a skimmer and recovered it, but effectively we do the same thing. Obviously, there's got to be some natural bacterial background to accomplish this. So this is what we're doing. This is what the plan was, and the science was during Deepwater Horizon. This science was known and was part of the planning process. Deepwater Horizon was not the last time dispersants were used. They've been used several other times, just not that much in the United States. But I've been involved in spills in other parts of the world where they have been. Okay, so when we talk about the dispersion, we're talking about some energy in the waves that allow it to disperse into the top part of the water column. We sometimes talk about top 3 to 10 meters. Frankly, I don't think it goes as deep as 10 meters. It depends on the amount of energy. So if you have an extremely high seas, it's going to go further down. But if you have light seas, it may not disperse very deep at all. So it's just the top part, and obviously then we're dealing with the near surface dwellers in that arrangement. Did I mention Stokes' law? Stokes' law, let's go back here. Stokes' law, which is a physics concept, is that these items, given different, what do we call it? Tom, help me out.
Droplet sizes?
Not droplet sizes, densities. If the density is less than water, these things are going to rise. If they're greater than water, they're going to sink. And so the oil is less than water, it will rise, and the rate of rise will be determined by the size of the droplet and the difference in density. So this is why I say, please don't say in front of a television news reporter, they use dispersants and they're sinking the oil. And frankly, my friends in the Coast Guard, I've heard Coast Guard people say this, and it drives me nuts. So Stokes' law says that the oil is going to rise, and Tom Coolbaugh will talk next about the subsea use of dispersants, and it plays very heavily in that. So what we're going to see is that oil on the top of the surface is going to diffuse the dispersed oil. going to diffuse and dilute, and ultimately in very short time gets down to less than 1 part per million and gets somewhat undetectable. When we're doing dispersant operations, we often want to monitor and use fluoroscopy to take a look at if there's any difference in the pre and post dispersant application. And what we want to see actually is a lot of oil, a lot of droplets in the water column initially. That tells us if we do a reading before, we don't see a lot of oil droplets in the water column, and we disperse, and we do, that's what we want to see. Over a very short time, it's going to dilute and diffuse to less than 1 part per million, and at that point we're starting to look at bacterial colonization and biodegradation. This just gives you a little view of what the concentrations might look at. On the left, it's 0 parts per million. On the far right, 1,000 parts per million. And what we look at when we're applying dispersant is seeing if the water gets cloudy. It may not happen immediately. It sometimes does. Other times it takes 5, 10, 15 minutes. And you generally do need some wave energy for this to happen. So what we would typically see is something on the order of, you can see that slight cloudiness that you're getting at 100 parts per million. You may see a little bit more, a little bit less of that. Sometimes it's whitish or milky, brownish, chocolate colored. But that tells us that the dispersant is in the water column. If you do some math, and my daughter stinks at math, but so I'm always helping her, but there's a very simple math problem. If you're going to take a look at, we typically say in 12 to 24 hours that the oil is going to be spread out enough to be either about 2.2 millimeters thickness, or by 24 hours like 0.1 millimeter thickness. So if you take that and just say we're going to have oil that's uniform at that at 0.2 millimeters or 0.1 millimeter, and you figure out square meters, you can come up very easily with the maximum concentrations, and that's what you have in those columns. So, you know, if we're looking at maximum concentrations mathematically of 200 parts per million or 100 parts per million at 1 meter, you can see 2 meters down, all the way down to 10 meters. So that kind of validates the numbers I gave to you before. Simple math. So what that means is, and one of the problems that we have with some of the studies that you see, is that most studies on toxicology are 48 hours LC50, meaning you expose a creature to a toxin for 48 hours and you see at what level the 50% of them die. Well, if we use 48 hours with using dispersant or dispersed oil, we're going to get a lot more creatures dying if it's a full 48-hour level concentration. But in nature, in a response, we don't have that type of concentration. We have a very short spike or a pulse that only lasts a matter of, let's say, 8, 12, I don't know, 16 hours. It depends. So we feel that some of the research that's been done with full LC50 48-hour exposure is not very valid, and that the reality is that a spiked pulse that you get in an actual oil spill is really what you should be using when you're doing research. I'll talk about some of that later. I mentioned stabilized droplets do not adhere to each other. So here's a feather that one on the bottom was dunked into crude oil, and the other on the top was dunked into dispersed crude oil. You can still see some traces of oil on there, but that's the difference you have when you use dispersants. Okay? Does dispersants work everywhere? No. First of all, there's a range of oil types that it works on, which is generally speaking, you know, light to medium and slightly heavy crude oils. If it's a super heavy crude oil, it's probably not going to disperse, and you better start getting your skimmers and your burning equipment together. So it's determined a little bit by the asphaltene and paraffin content, the viscosity and things of that nature. I mentioned we do need some mixing energy to make it work. It does, to some degree, work on emulsified oil and can possibly reverse that. There's been some studies done on that. The COREXIT 9500 is what was used in Deepwater Horizon, and that's a newer formulation from COREXIT 9527, which when I started in 91 was the dispersant of the day. So the COREXIT 9500, 3 seconds? Okay, we're going. All right. Just about the dispersant itself, it's made, it was intentionally made by FDA-approved food-grade dispersant, surfactants, and other products that are household type of products. So it's nothing that is very unique, or they're products all the time that you see. Matter of fact, one component, which is DOS, is used, that's a bottle that we had around the house. If you ever are in surgery, you need to stay loose. You're given 100 milligrams of this a day. But there's been a lot of controversy about the fact that there's traces of DOS in the Gulf of Mexico, which I would expect because DOS is also used in laundry products. And there's a tremendous amount of water with DOS in it coming down the whole Mississippi river system. Very important, we look at net environmental benefit analysis, determine what we're going to do. It's all about trade-offs, and I think Dr. Overton talked about that. If we're going to disperse, we generally are doing it to try to keep oil from hitting the shoreline, but that means we're going to put oil in the water column. And that goes back to what Admiral Allen said, you know, there's nothing good about this. We still have to deal with the oil, and it's either going to be one place or another, but we're going to try to choose that in order to make the best decision for the environment. So this was a project I've been involved in Panama, where you can see the top picture is crude oil that's not dispersed going in the coral, seagrass, mangrove environment, and the bottom is where it's dispersed. And you get different creatures and different organisms are being exposed to it in different ways. And in this particular case, we generally say, let's try to preserve the ecosystem for repopulation rather than the other way around. It takes a careful study, and I don't want to go into too much detail, but this is started in 1984, and this science was available during and leading up to Deepwater Horizon and still is. When not to use dispersants, there are times not to use dispersants. First of all, I mentioned if it's the wrong oil. Some won't disperse, so don't waste your money, time, and effort, and don't put an extra pollutant in the environment. But you don't want to do it near once-through cooling systems or water desalination plants and the like, and in waters that are directly over fish farms, and also in areas where there's very little circulation. So a large bay, yes. A very small bay or cove, perhaps not. You want to get the diffusion and dilution. Okay. Just to wrap up, we're involved in the full range of dispersant operations, and you can see it, if you can see it says we talk about a variety of application systems. We have to maintain a dispersant supply. We have a lot of logistics support and safety issues. But the one thing on the far left is about decision making, and that's critical. We don't have all day to make this decision. So in my view, one of the most important parts in either your planning and in your contingency plans or in your operations is to look at what's going to be the decision making. That's what the RRTs do. They have put together policies and procedures for deciding whether or not to use it. So that's the first part in a dispersant operation is decision making. So here are a little bit of the advantages and disadvantages of each. Again, we can remove the wind vector, form droplets that don't adhere, allow for diffusion, increase biodegradation, but we are looking, the bottom right there says there's a trade-off. We're going to protect the shoreline, but we're going to sacrifice, and it depends how you look at the creatures in the water column. We're going to put the oil into the water column, but keep in mind it's going to be a short pulse concentration exposure that is going to fall off very rapidly. So we think that's a good way to go. So this is a view out the front end of an airplane flying over the Deepwater Horizon spill. I think what was done there was a good thing. It kept most of the oil off the shoreline. And days we did not disperse, we saw the oil hit the shoreline, which was very sad, quite honestly. And just to throw in a little plug, OSRL and the industry feels important that this is an important enough issue that we have now configured 2 727 aircraft. They're based in the UK to be oil industry dispersant response anywhere in the world. And if there's ever a real big one, like with Deepwater Horizon, we'd all get together and do what we need to do. So sorry for going over.
Thank you.
There we go.